Hello, YouTube friends and fans. You've reached Fred and John Talks. I'm John, and this is
Fred. Who else?
Welcome, Fred.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us again. You know, if you've watched any of our videos, you'll notice that we have been talking about loneliness and related topics. And one time after one of our talks, Fred and I were chatting about further talks, and he introduced me to the topic of Real Boys, a book by William Pollack and his colleagues. And apparently it's a 20-year study done at Harvard. Is that correct? And most of you would know when you follow us on YouTube that we talk about adults and what to do about loneliness in adults and what to do in the community. But Fred wants to talk about real boys, and the why of this is that we want to understand the emotional life of boys better, and this is a different topic than we've ever kind of addressed before. But Fred has been a counselor for almost 40 years.
I've been in the helping professions for 40 years, 32 of them as a professional therapist, marital and mental health.
So even though it may be kind of a controversial topic, this book goes backwards 20, 30, 40 years almost.
Goes back, I'll explain that.
Yeah, so Fred is going to take it away, and I will probably ask questions.
Okay, very good. Well, let me give you the backdrop to this story first. First, let me hold up the book. It's called Real Boys, Rescuing Our Sons from the Myths of Boyhood by William Pollack and his many colleagues. It was a long-term, to be exact, 2-decade study at Harvard University about the emotional life of boys. And the results weren't pretty, and we'll be spelling that out. The backdrop is that when I was living in Rome, Italy, I somehow always harken back to Rome, Italy. I lived there from 1999 to 2001, and this book came out in 1998. So I read it when I was living in Italy. I'll never forget the impact it had on me.
A long time ago. Yeah.
So do the math. If it was this book was the result of a 20-year study and was published in 1998, well, then this study began in the 1970s sometime.
Yeah.
However, I want to say right from the start that this material is still relevant to today. It's not outdated. Hopefully, I like to think, the optimistic part of me would like to think that things have gotten better. But in my counseling practice, I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing more emotionally healthy and intelligent boys. So it continues. So I want to start with just a little blurb that I pulled off the internet. It says, with author appearances on Good Morning America, The Today Show, 2020, and NPR's Fresh Air, and featuring articles in Newsweek, Time, and the New York Times, Real Boys is one of the most talked about and influential books published this year, 1999. Now there was an updated version, I think in 2005, with a new forward,
new edition,
new forward and introduction, and that's valuable. But continuing on, based on William Pollack's groundbreaking research at Harvard Medical School over 2 decades, Real Boys explores why many boys are sad, lonely, and confused, although they may appear tough, cheerful, and confident. Pollack challenges conventional expectations about manhood and masculinity that encourage parents to treat boys as little men, raising them through a toughening process that drives their true emotions underground.
Oh, I like that. I like that phrase.
Yes.
That their emotions.
This is a great setup from what I'm going to be sharing from the book.
Great.
Only when we understand what boys are really like, says Pollack, can we help them develop more self-confidence and the emotional savvy they need to deal with issues such as depression, love and sexuality, drugs and alcohol, divorce, and violence.
Well, let me just comment real quickly. In 2024, there has become an issue of their sexuality. It just seems like in the last 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 or 10 at most, that boys are experiencing a real challenge as to whether they should be changing their sex in their sexuality. I know that's not your topic, but I mean, that's another variable in what they're having to deal with.
It is. It is. Yeah. So let me go over some of the, what I call the setup points leading up to the real meat of the study and to the findings.
Okay.
Because they studied boys starting in infancy.
Oh, wow.
These were controlled, like a lot of research, or most research, they were controlled studies where they had volunteers.
Okay.
They had mothers come in with their sons and daughters so they could study if there was any contrast in how they were raised right from infancy. Here's the first tidbit. More often than not, infant girls were held by their mothers facing in, with the girls facing mother. More often than not, boys were held facing out. Draw your own conclusions from that, but it started in infancy, where they didn't nurture boys like they nurtured girls.
That's fascinating, Fred. As a retired OBGYN doctor, I help pull them out, deliver them out, but I don't think I really paid that much attention to how they held the baby. I kind of remember mothers standing with and sitting with babies on their hips and the swivel and the rocking motion, but
yeah.
Facing out, facing in.
Yeah.
Okay.
The next tidbit, due to the injunctions of what's called the boy code, which I'll be spelling out later, it's a 4-point boy code. Boys' emotional lives are suppressed. So, as I just said, they're most often held facing out. Secondly, in toddlerhood, when girls went away from their mothers to play with the other children, if they scraped their knee or they got their feelings hurt, they come running to mama, and they were very comforted over a period of time.
Okay.
They dried their tears, they held them facing in, and then they sent them back to play.
No Band-Aid?
Yes, with girls. Well, they always use Band-Aids even with boys. But to be fair, but with boys were comforted at a much, this was another surprising finding by the observations of the researchers, that when boys came with their skinned knees and their hurt feelings and their tears, very briefly comforted and told to, go back. So the unspoken message is, be tough. Go back in.
You can deal with it.
Yeah. So right from the start, boys didn't get that comfort, like they were expected to be grown men at age 5. Go back and be tough. Okay. And one thing I left out that I didn't even put in my notes, but I remember, this is fascinating, and I don't know if you observe this in your gynecological practice. The research observed that from toddlerhood and infancy and toddlerhood, boys in the main, there were exceptions, were more emotionally expressive than girls.
Early on.
But as we'll see as we go through this, their emotional life then got stunted and repressed.
Repressed. Okay.
Yes. Okay, moving right along. Do you have any questions before I move along?
So you're basically saying they tend to have their emotions driven underground.
Yes.
Possibly.
They're tender emotions, as we'll see later, but I'll throw it in now. When they presented with anger, they were either accepted or rewarded for that, because anger shows toughness. And to contrast that with girls, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, there was an old saying, nice girls don't get angry. And for boys, the allowable emotion, the most allowable emotion was anger, because that shows toughness. But think about what you're doing to a 5-year-old boy. You're driving his tender emotions, his hurt, his disappointment, his fear, his sadness. You're driving that underground. So here's what they found as time went on. Remember, this is a longitudinal study.
20-year study.
Yes. So they would bring the boys back some years later. So now I'm going to segue into pre-adolescent boys and the private interviews they had with them.
Okay.
When the pre-adolescent boys came back for interviews behind closed doors, and they were asked to identify their tender and vulnerable emotions, as I just said, I named a few: hurt, sadness, disappointment, fear. They were able to identify their emotions, but they said to the interviews in so many words, "But I dare not show those feelings for fear of being called a sissy or being said, man up, man up."
This is in the pre-adolescent boys.
Yes, pre-adolescence. So you have to note the trajectory here. This was a process in which, like I said, it ends badly because when they came back in their older teens, and then as they approached 20, and they had the same interviews behind closed doors, by that time they were so accustomed to suppressing and repressing, and there is a psychological difference based on my mental health practice, which I need not go into, but anyway, maybe another time. Behind closed doors, when they were asked to identify their tender emotions that I mentioned, they could not name them.
So they had self-confidence in other ways, but they couldn't come forward with those tender emotions.
They had self-confidence only to the degree that they showed toughness. But they were, over years and years, here's the price you pay for suppressing your feelings over years and years. You get out of touch with them, and then by the time they were older teens, they couldn't even access those feelings. We have a saying in therapy: when you bury an emotion, and what I mean by an emotion is a negative emotion, sadness, pain, fear. When you bury an emotion, you bury it alive.
Ooh.
And what happens with the burying of tender emotions is, and the only acceptable emotion being anger and toughness, that sets boys up to become angry young men, angry young husbands, perhaps prone to violence. Not all of them.
But that's part of their exterior then, is anger,
Yes.
anger and reaction like that.
And let me add that the violence can be either directed outward, so that it could lead to criminality, or, like I've seen in my practice, the violence, emotional violence, is turned inward.
Yes, self-destruction.
Self-destruction.
Yeah.
So by the time they reach my office, we've raised, society and parents have raised generations of emotionally crippled men. Is it any wonder that wives' complaints in the counseling office are, "My husband doesn't express his true feelings to me. All he expresses is anger, and that's scary to me."
At that point, men don't have emotional savvy, and
Yes.
and they don't know how to express love.
Exactly. And to put it another way, they don't have the emotional vocabulary.
Oh,
I actually give a lot of my adult men in counseling, marriage counseling, feeling wordless.
Okay.
Feeling wordless, because they have to learn a whole new vocabulary that they were denied in childhood.
Okay.
How sad is that?
It is sad. How do these boys who become men deal with disillusionment and failure?
Great question. And it will come as no surprise to you or our audience. A lot of self-medicating,
Okay.
drugs, alcohol, pornography, gambling, workaholism, and so on. And so you have, again, men who, because the emotions and the body are all connected, it's all one system, far more illnesses, psychiatric and medical.
Do they experience the desire to kind of experiment with their sexuality?
May have a confused sexuality, if particularly if they had a harshly critical father. They may identify as with more their feminine side, or identify more with their mother and their sisters, and see themselves as feminine. There is such a thing, I'll throw this in, as developmental homosexuality. Now there is, because I've seen it, there are born homosexualities. I grew up across the street from one. But there's developmental homosexuality too, and I'll tell you how that works psychologically.
Okay.
They identify because they have harsh, rejecting, even abusive fathers.
Yes.
So they reject masculinity,
Okay.
toxic masculinity, as demonstrated by their fathers.
Understandable, yes.
They identify with their feminine side. And so then when they hit puberty, they are attracted to, quote, the opposite sex. What's the opposite of feminine? Masculine. They're attracted to men.
Okay.
And they confuse it with sexuality. But what they're after is a healthy masculinity. It's very complex, very psychologically complex.
In the pre-adolescence into adolescenthood, in women, I saw a lot of bulimia and anorexia. Do young boys suffer from that as well?
That back in the day when
Eating disorders, basically.
boy, you're asking great. You always ask great questions. Back in the day when eating disorders were front and center, not only in the mental health community but in society, anorexia nervosa, bulimia, and those are still around. I don't have expertise in that area, so I don't know how prevalent that is today. But back then, one of the dirtiest kept secrets was that a lot of boys had it too. It was focused largely on treating girls, but a lot of boys had it too. Yeah, and that's again violence turned inward. They say, like I say, I have limited knowledge of the psychology of this, but one thing I know is they say that eating disorders at the heart and center of it are control factors. They were parented by overly controlling parents, and so as they came into their adolescence, they said, "Oh, even subconsciously, what I can control is what I eat and what my body looks like."
So, I think Pollack, the author, William Pollack, uses the phrase a silent crisis. Is that a phrase that he uses, or it's been referred to with boys, that we're experiencing a silent crisis? This is going on. It doesn't seem to be talked about. It's not in the billboards. It's not in television. It's not in talking shows on television, anything like that. So is this a crisis that's going on even today in 2024?
Absolutely, and it's borne out in my own practice and in the colleagues I talk to. Let me move this along by sharing two things from the book. One is, in Real Boys, Pollack debunks the three most pervasive and erroneous myths about boys. There's three. Myth number one, boys will be boys. The myth is, where there are boys, there is testosterone. Where there is testosterone, there's aggression. And where there's aggression, there's violence, or at least its potential. But the reality is, most people believe that testosterone controls a boy's behavior. The truth is that while it may determine patterns of behavior, it does not determine a boy's behavior. Boys are as much products of nurture as they are of nature. Now let me throw in here too.
That's parenting.
Yes. Now let me throw in here too, and I'm going back in time in our interview about feelings. I say to my clients, feelings are not masculine or feminine. They are human.
And universal.
Myth number two, boys should be boys. Boys must fit the gender stereotype as, quote, gender straitjacket society has for them. Tough, dominant, and macho. The reality, there are many ways to be masculine. Sensitivity, a close maternal attachment, and activities that are not traditionally masculine are natural and do not make a boy any less manly in adulthood. In fact, I will tell you, as a person who's counseled hundreds of, and maybe thousands by now, after 32 years, of married couples, emotionally intelligent boys, men, make the best husbands. Okay. And myth number 3, boys are toxic. The belief that boys are psychologically unaware, emotionally unsocialized creatures. The reality, boys are just as caring as girls. They may have different patterns of behavior and learn and communicate through action, but they are as capable as being sensitive and empathic as girls are.
I think they also learn to be that way, Fred, by seeing how their father behaves with their mother, and their mother behaves back to the father. I think,
That's big.
yeah, an observation going on in the family, I think, helps set the role too.
That's very big. That's the first school of learning about feelings and relationships. So let's move toward the latter part of our interview here by outlining the findings of Real Boys as outlined in the book, and I highly recommend the book to anyone interested in this topic. The Boy Code has 4 injunctions. 1, the sturdy oak. Men and boys should not show weakness. No crying, whimpering, or expressions of hurt allowed. 2, give 'em hell. Boys are expected to be physically aggressive, highly active risk takers. Boys also learn early on that some of their bad behavior will be written off, as boys will be boys at least, and as rewarded at worst. 3, the big wheel. Status and dominance are crucial. Working to get to the top of the pack or climb the ladder, no matter what the cost, is essential. No shame allowed.
This is the popular boy, Mr. Popular.
Yep. And last but not least, no sissy stuff. Feelings, according to the Boy Code, are the province of women, especially tender feelings.
Sometimes I think that plays into men wanting to let the women raise the children, or let the women take care of the emotional outbursts of a child.
Yes.
Deal with all those feelings and sensitivities and crying and shouting.
Yes.
And disillusionment.
Okay.
Unhappiness.
Yes. Okay. To wrap up, our listeners are always giving us great feedback, and they say, so we get all that's wrong. What can we do about it? And I've got some tidbits for you.
Go for it.
The remedies, the antidotes to these toxic processes is embedded in the results of this research I just cited and can be summed up in several ways. Teach boys to identify and process their feelings, thus leading to emotional wellness and emotional intelligence. And here I might add Daniel Goleman's groundbreaking book, Emotional Intelligence, but that's for another interview. 2, refrain from shaming boys for merely being human and having tender feelings.
So shaming is a very bad...
Shaming is a big one.
No.
3, don't encourage repression of boys' tender emotions. In fact, facilitate the full range of emotional expression to include hurt, pain, sorrow, frustration, disappointment, sadness, fear, love, tenderness, loneliness, etc. And lastly, fight against the stigma, the taboo of emotionally sensitive boys and men, and educate yourself about emotional intelligence. And last, and certainly not least, I have something, and this is serendipitous. I just came across this article 2 or 3 days ago on the internet. It's by a woman. It's titled, I am a psychologist and a mom, and here are 3 phrases I wish more parents would say to their kids.
Oh, okay.
And this is by Caitlin Slavens. 3 things she wishes more parents would say to their kids to teach them emotional intelligence. I see you feel angry about this right now, and I can understand why. And then there's a couple sentences under that, which I won't go into. It'll be too long of an interview.
That's a good lead-in phrase.
Yes. And she focuses mostly on anger here because anger is the most unruly emotion, and especially with men. 2, I care about how you feel, and I will help you through this. What can we do right now? Imagine sitting down. You know, I had wonderful parents, but they weren't educated in this stuff. And I was a tender heart. I still am. I wish I had somebody who asked me those questions.
Well, it also shows that a willingness to deal with it right now.
Yes.
What's the...
The third and last one is, how big is your anger right now? And I will say, this strategy involves externalizing the emotion, and it's my favorite one to teach parents. Kids, especially deep feelers, often will not want to admit that they are feeling an emotion that is perceived as negative. And that leads us to probably a wrap-up, unless you have one more great question, which you're famous for.
Well, one thing that kind of reminds me is that whenever I was unhappy about the way my daughters were behaving, I didn't raise men, but I feel that parents should not shame their children in public or in front of other people.
Yes.
We usually would say to our daughter, we're going to talk about this in the car.
Very good.
Get up from the restaurant with me now, please. We're going to go outside and dealing with the problem at that point out of view of other people. That gets rid of the shame factor.
Which proves why you have 2 healthy adult daughters.
I love my daughters. And by the way, there's a book about raising girls.
Yes.
Please mention that.
The corollary to this was a book that was written in 1994, and if I'm not mistaken, had a follow-up to it. Is called Reviving Ophelia.
Yes.
Ophelia is a character in a Shakespeare play. That's for another interview, and that book is by Mary Pfeiffer, Pipher. Reviving Ophelia, that's for another discussion.
I would say that's a wrap, Fred.
Yes, it is.
You've put out so much information there that people really should pay attention to this video. I think it's a really good one. So we're going to sign off now. Goodbye, YouTube friends, and please like us on Facebook
And
share.
subscribe.
Subscribe and share. Bye-bye.